Think COVID was bad? Imagine a world where you are barely surviving the deadliest war in history, only to die of a cough on the boat ride home. This is the reality for 1918 America, where in a single year, life expectancy plummeted by 12 years. This was a pandemic that uniquely hunted the young and the healthy. Between the ages of 20 and 40, you didn't just have a risk, you were the primary target, facing the highest mortality rates on the planet. While World War I was turning the soil of Europe into a graveyard for over 100,000 Americans, the Spanish flu was single-handedly turning cities into hollowed-out ghost towns, claiming over 500,000 lives in the shadows of the trenches. This is the darkest year in American history. The nation was already under immense pressure by the start of 1918. Millions of young American men have been registered from the draft, and hundreds of thousands were pulled from farms, factories, and small towns and sent to training camps across the country. These camps were built in a rush. Places like Camp Funston in Kansas, Camp Devens in Massachusetts, and Camp Lewis in Washington filled almost as soon as they opened. And let's be honest, this ain't no summer camp. Inside the camps, soldiers slept in long rows of wooden bunks, often just a few feet apart. Barracks were cold in winter, stifling when packed full and poorly ventilated. Windows were often shut, sanitation was weak, clean water was limited. Men trained all day, returned exhausted, and crowded together at night, sharing air, blankets, canteens, and fatigue. Doctors were few, supplies were basic, and there was little space to separate the sick from the healthy. Everything about camp life was designed so they could be ready for war as quickly as possible. It didn't help that medicine at the time was very limited. For example, antibiotics did not exist. There were no antiviral drugs. Infections that are easily treated today could become deadly. Doctors and nurses sometimes used whiskey to disinfect wounds or dull pain, a practice unthinkable now, but in 1918 it was often all they had. Once infection entered the bloodstream, it could turn into sepsis. Fevers spiked, hearts raced, patients became confused and delirious. They slipped in and out of consciousness as their bodies shut down piece by piece. Skin would then grow cold and pale. Sadly, doctors could not stop it. They could only watch. At the same time, factories across the country ran non-stop to support the war. Workers were working long shifts, often in very dangerous conditions. Injuries occurred quite often. America was already exhausted, strained by war, industry, and fear. The first known case showed up at Camp Funston in Kansas. A camp cook named Albert Gitchell walked into the hospital with a fever, a sore throat, and a headache. It didn't seem unusual. Doctors saw this kind of thing all the time, especially in the winter, so they assumed it was just the flu and told him to rest. By the end of that same day, more soldiers started showing up with the same symptoms. Then, more. Within a few days, there were hundreds. Training didn't stop. Soldiers still drilled, ate together, and moved in and out of camp. A lot of them felt a little sick, but not sick enough to report it, so they kept going. From spring into summer of 1918, the United States was sending troops to Europe at an enormous pace. Hundreds of thousands of young American men were crossing the Atlantic, training briefly and being pushed toward the front. The war had entered a decisive phase. Germany launched massive attacks in the spring, trying to win before American strength fully arrived, and the fighting intensified. Soon enough, American units were thrown into combat faster than planned. American soldiers didn't just die from one big offensive, but through constant movement and bombardment by artillery fire, and smaller offensives that piled up losses day by day. Many were inexperienced, many were exhausted. Casualty lists grew steadily through the summer, filling newspapers and pulling their attention towards the war. Families focused on sons dying overseas, even though the epidemic had been rampant, infecting 1 out of 4 people in the country. It had largely subsided. Their dread was not on an illness that most people seemed to survive at home. In September of 1918, the illness came back suddenly, and this time it moved fast, much faster than before. People didn't have weeks to get sick. Sometimes they didn't even have days. The first warning signs appeared in port cities where ships were constantly coming and going. Sailors arrived sick, dock workers followed, then soldiers, then families. Hospitals that had only recently emptied began filling again almost overnight. Doctors noticed they were falling behind. They were no longer catching up. Patients weren't just weak anymore. Young, healthy adults struggled to breathe. Some turned blue within hours. In Philadelphia, doctors begged city officials to cancel a massive Liberty Loan parade scheduled for September 28th. They warned that crowds would be dangerous. The warnings were ignored. More than 200,000 people packed the streets, shoulder to shoulder, cheering and waving flags, convinced the worst was behind them. Within 3 days, hospitals were overwhelmed. Within a week, the city was drowning in sickness. By the end of September, more than 12,000 people in Philadelphia alone were dead, and the same pattern was unfolding everywhere else. By October, everything gave way at once. Hospitals across the country started to feel like a place trying not to collapse. Patients arrived faster than doors could close. Beds filled first, then hallways, then stairwells. Soon, people were sitting on benches, lying on floors, waiting outside hospital entrances, wrapped in blankets, gasping for air because there was nowhere else to put them. Doctors stopped jotting down details the way they used to, not because they didn't care, but because there simply wasn't time. Nurses worked until they dropped. Many never came back, not because they quit, but because they became patients themselves. At the same moment, the war reached its own breaking point. In late September and straight through October, the United States launched the Meuse-Argonne offensive, the largest attack Americans had ever fought. More than 1 million young men were pushed forward because commanders believed this was the final chance to end the war. Everyone was exhausted. Everyone wanted it over. The fighting wasn't quick or clean. Soldiers were sent into dense forests where you couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. The ground was torn apart by shells. Trenches collapsed. Mud pulled at boots. Machine guns were hidden in the trees, and artillery never really stopped. Men were ordered forward again and again, sometimes across the same ground where others had just fallen. Some were killed instantly. Others were wounded and left where they fell because it wasn't safe to reach them. Nights were cold. Food ran low. Sleep barely happened. When soldiers were finally pulled off the line, many weren't just wounded. They were worn down to nothing. They boarded trains coughing, feverish, barely standing. Some believed they had survived the worst. They had lived through the forest. They had lived through the guns. But many carried the sickness with them. They brought it back to camps, to hospitals, to cities, to homes. Some died days after returning, not from bullets or shells, but from an illness their bodies were too weak to fight anymore. Back home, the country began to shut itself down. Schools closed. Churches locked their doors. Theaters went dark. Public gatherings were banned. Moving through cities that felt hollow and tense, fear settled into daily life. Every cough froze a room. Every fever felt like a sentence. People crossed streets to avoid one another. Neighbors spoke through closed doors. Death overwhelmed everything. Morgues filled within days. Bodies were stored wherever space could be found. Basements, hallways, storage rooms. Coffins ran out. Funerals were banned. Families weren't allowed to gather or say goodbye. In some homes, entire families vanished in a matter of days. Parents watched children fade within hours. Children woke to find parents cold and still. In many neighborhoods, bodies remained inside houses for days, wrapped in sheets, waiting because no one was left to collect them. October didn't feel like a month. It felt like a collapse. Nearly 195,000 Americans died in just 31 days. When it ended, nothing snapped back into place. The silence stayed. The empty homes stayed. The grief stayed. The virus moved on, but the country never truly did.